The stun baton crackles in the dark. You hear it before you see it, that sharp, electric hiss cutting through silence like a promise of pain. Then comes the voice, sweet and venomous at once, calling you sweetheart, calling you little piggy, telling you that good behavior gets rewarded and bad behavior needs correction. Somewhere deeper in the facility, a woman speaks with prophetic certainty about God's will and purification through suffering. Her conviction so absolute that it unsettles the listener, raising the question of whether she is broken or whether certainty itself has become the most dangerous force in the room. Twins move as one organism, their conjoined bodies a nightmare of aristocratic entitlement fused with chemical contamination, hunting through shadows with the patience of predators who've never known anything except getting exactly what they want. And at the docks, a man with a cherubic face and dead eyes stalks you with the same emotional investment an accountant brings to filing taxes. This is the Sinyala facility in 1959. This is where the Murkoff Corporation took the CIA's MK Ultra research and asked a darker question. The government wanted to know if you could reprogram a human being. Murkoff wanted to know if you could industrialize the process, turn psychological destruction into assembly line efficiency, create sleeper agents by the dozens while refining techniques that would shape institutional horror for generations. And the people who made this possible, the prime assets who served as Murkoff's most effective instruments of trauma, they weren't monsters created in laboratories. They were human beings whose mental illnesses, personality disorders, and trauma responses made them perfect for work that would break anyone with intact empathy or functional moral reasoning. Over the next few hours, we're examining every major character in Outlast Trials using real psychiatric frameworks. We're talking antisocial personality disorder, dissociative identity disorder, delusional disorder with religious features, shared psychotic disorder, complex post-traumatic stress responses, and psychological presentations so severe they require their own clinical categories. But here's what separates this from typical asylum horror. These characters aren't scary because they're mentally ill. They're scary because Murkoff found people whose specific psychiatric conditions made them useful, gave them institutional authority, and turned their pathology into curriculum. The violence isn't random chaos. It's weaponized psychology, deployed with purpose, refined through repetition, all in service of breaking people systematically enough to rebuild them as tools. By the end, you'll understand how each prime asset's mental health condition shaped their role at Sinyala, why certain diagnoses made someone valuable, and what it means when an institution decides that some forms of madness are assets rather than liabilities. You'll see how childhood trauma creates adults who view cruelty as problem-solving, how religious conviction becomes indistinguishable from psychosis, how dissociation protects someone from their own actions while making those actions more terrible, and how the absence of certain normal human responses creates people who can torture without hesitation or remorse. If you find this video entertaining, please drop a comment letting me know. You can also throw out a topic suggestion for a future video. I'm always looking for the next game rabbit hole to fall into, and some of the best video ideas have come from you guys. I love this community we are building and how we interact with each other in the comments. So get comfortable, dim the lights, and let's start. Chapter 1, The Architect's Pathology. Before we can diagnose the weapons, we need to understand the man who selected them. Hendrik Joliet Easterman didn't wake up one morning and decide to become a torturer. The path to directing Project LATHE began decades earlier, in a childhood where every mistake became evidence of inadequacy, where a mother's criticism carved itself into bone, where a boy learned that his worth would always be measured against impossible standards and found wanting. Picture Easterman as a child, fragile, sickly, constantly corrected by a mother who saw weakness in everything he did. His brother Stanley seemed to earn approval more easily. creating competition that would define Hendrik's entire existence. Every childhood stumble proved he would never be enough, never worthy, never significant. This kind of upbringing doesn't just create insecurity. It creates people who spend their lives trying to prove they deserve to exist, who measure worth through external achievement because they never developed internal value. The psychiatric term is maladaptive perfectionism combined with narcissistic vulnerability. Easterman exhibited the classic pattern of someone whose self-esteem depends entirely on accomplishment and recognition from authority figures. His mother's abuse, emotional rather than physical but no less damaging, created what's called an external locus of self-worth. He couldn't generate self-approval internally. Every achievement was an attempt to finally earn the validation that had been withheld during the years when identity forms. This drives certain people toward academic excellence as a form of psychological survival. Easterman accumulated degrees like armor against the voice in his head that still sounded like his mother. Psychology, psychiatry, behavioral research. He became an expert in how minds work, how they break, how they can be reshaped. In another era, with different opportunities, he might have done legitimate therapeutic work. But Easterman came of age in the 1940s and 50s, when governments were redrawing the boundaries of acceptable research, when the Cold War created demand for psychological weapons, and when someone with his specific combination of brilliance and damaged self-worth could find institutions willing to enable his worst impulses. His early research involved prisoners and psychiatric patients, populations whose consent was either coerced or legally meaningless. He developed techniques for breaking down resistant subjects, creating psychological states where people would confess to anything, believe anything, do anything to make pressure stop. This work circulated in intelligent circles, catching attention from people who saw applications far beyond prison reform or clinical treatment. The diagnostic picture for Easterman is complex because his pathology served him professionally. He likely met criteria for narcissistic personality disorder, specifically the vulnerable subtype. Unlike grandiose narcissists who present with obvious arrogance and entitlement, vulnerable narcissists are characterized by hypersensitivity to criticism, intense shame, and need for validation that drives compulsive achievement. They experience themselves as inadequate while simultaneously believing they deserve recognition, creating internal tension that fuels endless striving. Easterman's relationship with his mother created this pattern. She provided enough intermittent reinforcement, occasional moments where he met her standards, to keep him hoping for approval while ensuring that approval remained conditional and unpredictable. This is psychologically similar to gambling addiction, where variable ratio reinforcement schedules create more persistent behavior than consistent rewards. Easterman kept achieving, kept proving himself, kept accumulating credentials, always chasing the moment when he'd finally be enough. The narcissistic injury, the deep wound to self-worth that narcissistic personality develops to defend against, came from his mother's message that he was fundamentally defective, his entire personality structure organized around denying that message while simultaneously believing it completely. The achievements said he mattered. The internal experience was that he was fraudulent, that discovery of his inadequacy was imminent, that only continued accomplishment could forestall the inevitable revelation that his mother had been right all along. This psychological structure made Easterman vulnerable to recruitment by organizations that offered what he desperately needed. When Murkoff approached him in 1954, they didn't just offer resources for research. They offered significance, the opportunity to direct a program, to prove theories, to achieve recognition that would finally silence his mother's voice. The fact that this required human experimentation was, from Easterman's perspective, the price of mattering. He exhibited minimal empathy for research subjects. a common feature in narcissistic personality disorder where others exist primarily as sources of validation rather than as beings with their own value. When subjects suffered in his experiments, Easterman experienced this as data rather than tragedy. Their pain served his advancement. That made it not just acceptable, but necessary. This is where understanding Easterman's pathology becomes crucial for understanding Project LATHE. He didn't design the program despite being mentally ill. He designed it because his specific mental illness made systematic cruelty feel like important work. His narcissistic need for recognition, his externalized self-worth, his emotional detachment from subjects, his ability to rationalize harm as advancement, all combined to create someone who could build an industrial torture program while experiencing himself as a dedicated scientist serving his country. The irony and the tragedy is that Murkoff exploited Easterman exactly the way he exploited research subjects. They identified his vulnerabilities, the desperate need for maternal figure approval now transferred onto institutional authority, and they used those vulnerabilities to make him complicit in atrocities. They told him he was brilliant, important, indispensable. They gave him resources and autonomy, and in exchange, he gave them techniques for breaking human consciousness that would serve corporate interests for decades. When his brother Stanley died, Murkoff withheld the truth. Stanley had committed suicide, but Murkoff told Easterman that Stanley had been captured during the Korean War and subjected to brainwashing. This lie served multiple purposes. It gave Easterman personal investment in defeating communist psychological techniques. It provided emotional justification for research that might otherwise have troubled even his damaged conscience. And it demonstrated Murkoff's willingness to manipulate their own employees. Easterman never discovered this deception. He spent years believing his work at Sinyala was partly revenge for what had been done to Stanley, that developing superior conditioning techniques would prevent other American soldiers from suffering Stanley's fate. The reality that Stanley had killed himself possibly because of family dynamics Easterman contributed to remained hidden. This allowed Easterman to maintain his self-image as someone doing necessary work rather than someone whose damaged psychology was being exploited to harm others. The documents recovered from Sinyala reveal Easterman's increasing paranoia as Project LATHE progressed. He believed Murkoff executives were plotting against him, that he was being poisoned, that his position was threatened. These weren't delusions. Murkoff was monitoring him, managing him, and would eventually discard him when his usefulness ended. But Easterman's interpretation of these threats was filtered through his narcissistic vulnerability. He experienced institutional manipulation as personal betrayal, as evidence that he still wasn't good enough, that even his most significant achievement couldn't earn the security and recognition he craved. This created escalating desperation. Easterman pushed Project LATHE harder, refined techniques more ruthlessly, demanded better results from prime assets, and higher success rates from reagent conditioning. He was trying to make himself indispensable, to prove his value so completely that Murkoff couldn't possibly discard him. Instead, he was creating documentation of human rights violations that would eventually require his elimination to protect corporate interests. The psychiatric diagnosis for Easterman includes narcissistic personality disorder with vulnerable features, likely adjustment disorder in response to professional stressors, and possible paranoid personality traits that emerged or intensified as Project LATHE progressed. He showed no evidence of psychotic symptoms. His reality testing remained intact, but his moral reasoning was profoundly impaired by personality, pathology, and institutional context that rewarded exactly the behaviors his disorder produced. Understanding Easterman matters because he selected every prime asset, designed their programs, and determined how their specific pathologies would be weaponized. His choices weren't random. He was looking for people whose mental illnesses would make them effective instruments of trauma while remaining controllable enough to serve institutional purposes. Each prime asset represented Easterman's answer to specific questions about how different forms of psychological damage could be channeled and deployed. That's the lens we need for examining the prime assets themselves. They weren't just mentally ill people who happened to work at Sinyala. They were carefully selected because their specific diagnoses made them useful to someone whose own pathology had convinced him that breaking people was important work. Chapter 2. Leland Coyle and the Weaponization of Authority. The sound of that stun baton announces him before he appears. You hear electricity crackling against metal, that sharp hiss that shouldn't belong in a police station but has somehow become part of the architecture. Then comes Leland Coyle himself, a former police sergeant whose badge was never about serving the community and always about having legal permission to hurt people who couldn't fight back. Understanding Coyle requires going back to Blackwell, Oklahoma in 1923. The town was small enough that everyone knew everyone's business, but it was also a sundown town, where Black Americans were legally prohibited from remaining after dark. Growing up in this environment taught specific lessons about how the world worked. Authority defined who counted as fully human. Violence was acceptable when directed at designated targets. Community approval came through participation in collective cruelty. And power meant being on the right side of arbitrary lines, dividing people into those who mattered and those who didn't. Coyle's childhood was marked by violence severe enough that later psychological evaluations identified it as foundational to his personality development. Murkoff's surveillance files explicitly list anecdotal evidence of abuse of animals and sexual assault under his teenage criminal tendencies. These weren't things done to him. These were things he was beginning to do to others, establishing patterns that would define his entire life. The psychiatric term is conduct disorder, the childhood precursor to antisocial personality disorder. Coyle exhibited behaviors associated with severe conduct disorder and future violence, particularly animal abuse, which desensitizes someone to suffering while teaching that causing pain can be gratifying. While the McDonald triad, which includes animal abuse, fire setting, and bedwetting, has been historically cited as predictive of violent behavior, research has shown this triad lacks strong empirical support and may be more of an urban legend than a validated clinical predictor. What's documented beyond question is the animal abuse and the emerging sexual violence, both strong predictors of adult antisocial personality disorder with violent features. Children who develop conduct disorder typically have experienced trauma that teaches them the world is fundamentally unsafe and that power is the only thing preventing victimization. Coyle learned during his formative years that inflicting pain brought a sense of control, absent from other areas of his life. The world contained people who would hurt you simply because they could. The only way to ensure safety was to be the one holding the weapon, to always be the predator rather than prey. This developmental trajectory creates several possible adult outcomes. Some victims of childhood trauma internalize powerlessness and spend their lives avoiding confrontation. Others develop profound empathy, recognizing their suffering in others and working to prevent similar harm. But some, like Coyle, develop the response pattern where power becomes the only thing that matters, where the world divides cleanly into those who hurt and those who get hurt, and where the only rational strategy is ensuring you're always in the first category. Coyle's involvement with the local Ku Klux Klan chapter as a teenager provided something crucial: institutional validation for his worst impulses. The violence he'd been enacting individually could now happen collectively, with community approval and protection of numbers. The cruelty he'd learned as a survival mechanism could be reframed as patriotic duty, as defense of traditional values, as protection of community purity. The cognitive dissonance that might have troubled someone with intact empathy simply didn't apply. He'd already learned that suffering was natural and that power justified itself. The death of his first wife, who fell downstairs only 6 months into their marriage, demonstrates the pattern continuing into adulthood. The circumstances were suspicious enough that questions were raised, but nothing was formally investigated. Coyle's connections, the same social networks that made his clan activities possible, protected him from consequences. He learned that violence could be gotten away with, that the right connections mattered more than evidence, that authority figures would look the other way when dealing with someone technically on their side. Military service in World War II taught Coyle that killing could be not just tolerated, but celebrated when it happened in the right context. He received commendations for confirmed enemy kills. His superiors valued his aggression and willingness to volunteer for dangerous assignments. But there were also rumors, never officially investigated, that 2 American soldiers in his unit died under suspicious circumstances while Coyle was present. Military investigators had limited capacity to pursue these questions in combat conditions, and if deaths could be explained through chaos or accident, there was little institutional incentive to dig deeper. When Coyle returned to Oklahoma and joined the Blackwell police force in 1947, he found the perfect position for someone with his psychology. Law enforcement offered authority, weapons, legal protection for violence, and a position commanding respect regardless of how that position was used. A badge transformed what would otherwise be assault into legitimate force. A uniform made intimidation into law enforcement. And the institutional culture of small-town police departments, where oversight was minimal and officers were protected by tight-knit communities, meant Coyle could operate with remarkable freedom as long as he maintained the appearance of professionalism. The diagnostic criteria for antisocial personality disorder require a pervasive pattern of disregard for and violation of the rights of others. Coyle met these criteria comprehensively. He showed repeated lying and conning for personal profit or pleasure, demonstrated through his ability to maintain respectable public image while engaging in systematic abuse. He exhibited impulsivity and failure to plan ahead, though this was somewhat moderated by his understanding that certain long-term strategies served his interests. He showed irritability and aggressiveness indicated by repeated physical fights and assaults, though much of this was calculated rather than impulsive. He demonstrated reckless disregard for safety of self and others. He showed consistent irresponsibility in work behavior, though paradoxically he maintained employment by choosing positions where his pathology was asset rather than liability. And crucially, he exhibited lack of remorse, being indifferent to or rationalizing having hurt, mistreated, or stolen from others. But Coyle's presentation included additional features beyond basic antisocial personality disorder. He showed sadistic personality traits, deriving pleasure from inflicting pain and humiliation on others. This goes beyond the instrumental violence typical of antisocial personality disorder, where harm serves specific goals like obtaining money or eliminating threats. Coyle enjoyed the process of hurting people, the fear in their eyes, the sounds they made, the knowledge that he had absolute power over their bodies, and they were helpless to stop him. These provided psychological gratification. His obsession with electricity specifically, which intensified during his police career, suggests a paraphilia developing alongside his sadistic features. He described lightning as the purest form of power, as violence without moral dimension, as destruction that simply existed without needing justification. The stun baton became his signature weapon. Combining his authority as a police officer with his sexual and aggressive pathology, the electrical burns he inflicted during interrogation served ostensibly legitimate purposes, extracting confessions or compliance, while simultaneously satisfying his sadistic needs. This combination, antisocial personality disorder with sadistic features and possible paraphilic elements made Coyle exactly what Easterman was looking for when designing Project LATHE. Coyle could inflict systematic trauma without experiencing guilt or moral conflict. He had decades of experience using institutional authority to legitimize cruelty. He understood how to calibrate violence for specific effects, how to hurt people enough to break them without causing death that would create complications. And he possessed what Easterman called charisma, the ability to dominate environments and influence others to adopt his perspective. When Murkoff recruited Coyle in 1956, they didn't threaten him. They made him an offer appealing to everything he'd been missing: a facility where he'd have authority over subjects who couldn't complain, the opportunity to use every technique he'd learned in war, and every impulse he'd had to restrain as a police officer. They told him he'd be helping America win the Cold War, that his work would prevent communist infiltration, that he was serving his country. Coyle didn't need much convincing. He'd been waiting his entire post-war life for someone to give him permission to be exactly who he was. At Sinyala, Coyle was designated a prime asset and given authority over a police station mock-up where he could interrogate and torture while scientists observed. His program was designed to create compliance through association of resistance with unbearable pain. Reagents who entered Coyle's program learned that disobedience brought electrical torture, that questioning authority resulted in systematic brutality, that the only way to survive was complete submission. But here's what Easterman initially failed to anticipate about deploying someone like Coyle. The charisma that made him effective also made him difficult to control. Guards began emulating his methods, adopting his justifications, seeing him as a model of strength. When facility personnel were supposed to restrain him, they instead found themselves seeking his approval. Within months, Coyle had effectively taken control of his section, with Murkoff's staff functioning as his assistants rather than his handlers. This revealed a crucial problem with using people with severe antisocial personality disorder and sadistic features as institutional assets. They can dominate environments in ways that subvert command structure. Coyle's violence escalated beyond what protocols specified. He began torturing reagents for longer durations and with greater severity than research objectives required. The electrical burns became more extensive. The psychological abuse intensified. He was losing whatever minimal restraint he'd maintained as a police officer, where at least the possibility of investigation created some limits. Easterman documented this degradation with clinical interest. He theorized that Coyle represented a specific failure mode for charismatic personalities. They could dominate environments and influence others, but they lacked internal coherence. Without external structure to contain them, they'd escalate until they burned out completely or were forcibly stopped. Coyle's antisocial personality disorder meant he had no internal brake, no mechanism that said, "This is too much," no empathy that made him experience subjects' suffering as reason to moderate behavior. The additional diagnosis for Coyle that emerged during his time at Sinyala was sexual sadism disorder, a paraphilic disorder where sexual arousal depends on inflicting psychological or physical suffering on another person. The electrical torture had clear sexual dimensions for Coyle. The positions he forced reagents into, the parts of their bodies he targeted, the language he used while shocking them, all suggested that the violence was providing erotic gratification alongside whatever professional satisfaction came from exercising power. The psychiatric portrait of Leland Coyle is someone whose childhood trauma and probably genetic predisposition created severe antisocial personality disorder with sadistic features and sexual sadism disorder. His condition made him incapable of empathy, driven to dominate others through violence, and sexually aroused by inflicting pain. Every institution he joined, the Klan, the military, law enforcement, Murkoff Corporation, provided context where his pathology could be expressed while maintaining social legitimacy. He never changed. He never needed to. The world kept giving him permission to be exactly what his disorders made him: a predator with a badge, authority weaponized, institutional protection for someone whose psychology made systematic cruelty feel like ordinary work. His story demonstrates how certain mental illnesses, particularly antisocial personality disorder with additional sadistic features, make someone valuable to institutions that need violence, delivered without hesitation or remorse. Coyle wasn't broken by Sinyala. He arrived pre-broken, and Murkoff simply gave him infrastructure. But while Coyle represents weaponized sadism and institutional authority, the next prime asset we need to examine demonstrates something psychologically distinct. What happens when someone's mind fractures so completely that multiple personalities emerge, each representing different survival strategies, and an institution decides those fragments can serve as curriculum? Let's talk about dissociative identity disorder and the woman who became Mother Gooseberry. Chapter 3: Phyllis Futterman and the Architecture of Fractured Identity. Moving through the orphanage at Sinyala with maternal purpose, she speaks in soothing tones about keeping children safe, about the importance of obedience, about how love sometimes requires discipline. But Phyllis Futterman, the person underneath that persona, barely exists as a coherent self anymore. Her mind shattered during childhood, fragmenting into alternate identities just to survive abuse so severe that no single consciousness could hold it all. Dissociative identity disorder, formerly called multiple personality disorder, is among the most controversial and misunderstood diagnoses in psychiatry. The condition develops almost exclusively in response to severe childhood trauma, typically sustained abuse beginning before age 9. When a child experiences suffering too overwhelming for their developing mind to process, dissociation provides an escape. The self fragments creating alternate identities that can hold different aspects of experience, different emotional states, different memories. What should be one integrated consciousness becomes multiple selves sharing the same body. Phyllis's childhood was a theater of horrors documented only in fragments. The abuse was severe enough and sustained enough that her mind couldn't remain whole. By adulthood, Phyllis as an original personality barely existed. Instead, there was Mother Gooseberry, a maternal alter who expressed love through violence and control. There was the fun persona, manic and childlike, treating torture like a game where the rules changed without warning. There were other alters, flickering in and out, each one a different survival strategy that had crystallized into its own consciousness. The diagnostic criteria for dissociative identity disorder require 2 or more distinct personality states, with discontinuity in sense of self and agency. These states must include recurrent gaps in recall of everyday events, important personal information, or traumatic events that are too extensive to be explained by ordinary forgetfulness. The disturbance must cause clinically significant distress or impairment in functioning, and cannot be attributable to substances or another medical condition. Phyllis met these criteria comprehensively. The Mother Gooseberry alter functioned as primary, the identity most frequently in control, but other alters emerged in response to specific triggers or situations. Each alter had distinct patterns of perceiving and relating to the environment. Mother Gooseberry spoke with calm authority, viewing herself as a protector keeping children safe from a dangerous world. The fun persona giggled and played games, experiencing violence as entertainment rather than harm. The transitions between these states were often sudden, triggered by environmental cues or internal conflicts that activated different alters. The amnesia between alters was significant. When Mother Gooseberry was in control, she had limited or no access to memories formed while other alters were active. This created discontinuity in her experience of time and events. She might find herself in locations without remembering how she arrived, discover evidence of actions she couldn't recall taking, hear staff reference things she'd said or done with no memory of the incidents. This fragmentation would be terrifying for most people with dissociative identity disorder, but Phyllis had lived with it for so long that the discontinuity felt normal. Each alter served specific psychological functions shaped by childhood trauma. The maternal altar developed as an attempt to provide the nurturing care Phyllis herself had been denied. But because Phyllis's only models for relationships came from abusive caregivers, Mother Gooseberry's version of maternal love replicated the violence and control that had been enacted on Phyllis as a child. She genuinely believed she was protecting children, keeping them safe through strict discipline and absolute obedience, unaware that she was perpetuating the same harm she'd experienced. The fun persona represented a different defense mechanism, the dissociative detachment that allowed Phyllis to survive by experiencing abuse as something happening to someone else, as a game with rules that could be learned and mastered, rather than as genuine threat to safety and well-being. This alter could engage in violence while maintaining emotional distance, experiencing actions as play rather than trauma. When this persona was active, the screams of reagents became sounds in a game. Their fear became part of the entertainment, and the violence became performance rather than reality. Phyllis had killed before Murkoff found her. The victims were children she believed she was saving from inadequate parents. In her fractured understanding, these murders were acts of love. The children were in danger from caregivers who didn't meet Mother Gooseberry's standards of proper parenting, and the only way to truly protect them was to remove them from this world entirely, before further harm could occur. This delusional framework allowed her to commit acts that would horrify most people while experiencing herself as heroic protector serving children's best interests. Her arrest should have led to institutionalization in a psychiatric facility where she might have received treatment for dissociative identity disorder. Instead, Murkoff intervened. They saw potential where others saw only madness. Easterman recognized that someone with Phyllis's particular presentation, multiple alters with different presentations of violence, profound disconnection from consequences of her actions, and delusional framework that reframed cruelty as care, could serve specific purposes at Sinyala. When Phyllis arrived at the facility, Easterman placed her in an orphanage setting filled with mannequin children. This environment activated Mother Gooseberry as the dominant alter, providing the maternal context where that identity felt most natural and necessary. The mannequins became real children in her fractured perception, or perhaps she understood they were mannequins, but experienced them as children, requiring her protection regardless. The distinction between reality and delusion was so thoroughly eroded that such questions became meaningless. Reagents who entered Mother Gooseberry's program encountered an environment designed to replicate childhood powerlessness. The orphanage setting triggered memories of being small, dependent, subject to adult authority that could be nurturing or violent without warning. Mother Gooseberry spoke in soothing tones about rules and safety, about how obedience would be rewarded and disobedience would require correction. The reagents became children in her eyes, and she related to them exactly as her abusive caregivers had related to her. The violence was not chaotic, but it was deeply destabilizing. When Mother Gooseberry was in control, punishment followed clear rules. She explained what the reagent had done wrong, why discipline was necessary, and how the suffering inflicted was meant for their own good. The abuse was systematic, framed as care and moral correction rather than cruelty. At other moments, her tone shifted into playfulness. Singing, games, and childlike language layered over the same disciplinary violence. These shifts did not remove the rules, but they obscured them, blending affection and punishment in ways that made resistance impossible. Reagents could not rely on emotional cues to anticipate safety or harm, only the certainty that both would arrive wrapped in the language of love. Mother Gooseberry's presence highlights one of Project LATHE's most corrosive contradictions, the fusion of cruelty and care. By framing violence as love and punishment as protection, she embodies a form of abuse that resists easy moral categorization. Observing such behavior, and whether as a reagent or an external witness, forces a confrontation with profound cognitive dissonance. The mind struggles to reconcile genuine expressions of affection with acts of extreme harm, destabilizing the ability to clearly label behavior as simply good or evil, nurturing or destructive. This ambiguity is not incidental, but central to the psychological damage Murkoff seeks to produce. The additional diagnosis that applied to Phyllis was delusional disorder with persecutory and grandiose features. Mother Gooseberry genuinely believed that children everywhere were in danger, that inadequate parents threatened their well-being, and that she had been chosen to serve as protector. This delusion was systematized and unshakable, resistant to contrary evidence because any evidence that contradicted it was simply reinterpreted through the delusional framework. When reagents resisted her authority or questioned her rules, Mother Gooseberry experienced this as evidence of corruption by dangerous outside influences. The resistance proved that the reagent needed more intensive correction, that her protective role was even more necessary than she'd realized. The delusion was self-reinforcing, making treatment nearly impossible without pharmaceutical intervention and intensive therapy that was never provided. Mother Gooseberry's program demonstrates how belief can be shaped under extreme control rather than merely enforced through fear. Prolonged exposure to isolation, stress, and pharmaceutical conditioning encourages reagents to internalize the language of obedience imposed on them. Over time, some begin to echo the moral framework used to justify their suffering, speaking in terms of failure, deserved punishment, and the necessity of discipline. This is not evidence of a documented shared psychosis, but an example of how absolute authority, expressed with total conviction and reinforced through conditioning, can reshape perception itself. What appears as belief transmission is the product of systemic coercion designed to collapse resistance from the inside. The psychiatric portrait of Phyllis Futterman is someone whose severe childhood abuse created dissociative identity disorder with multiple distinct alters, each representing different trauma responses and survival strategies. The Mother Gooseberry alter combined delusional disorder with behavioral patterns that replicated the abuse Phyllis had experienced, reframing cruelty as protective care. Other alters provided different functions, some allowing emotional distance from violence, others expressing rage or fear that the primary personality couldn't consciously access. Her condition made her valuable to Murkoff because the fragmentation created unpredictability, creating an environment of constant threat where anxiety remained elevated, even during moments without active violence. And Mother Gooseberry's genuine belief that she was helping, protecting, and loving the children under her care created cognitive dissonance in observers that made her programs particularly effective at destabilizing reagents' sense of reality. Unlike Coyle, whose sadism was straightforward and whose violence served his gratification, Phyllis genuinely believed she was serving children's best interests. This made her perhaps more disturbing than prime assets who acknowledged their cruelty. She experienced herself as heroic, as sacrificing her own comfort to do necessary protective work, as a loving mother figure making hard choices for the good of those in her care. The complete absence of insight into the harm she caused, combined with the sincere conviction that her actions expressed love, created a horror that went beyond simple violence into the realm of incomprehensible moral inversion. Her story demonstrates how dissociative identity disorder, particularly when combined with delusional disorder and history of severe abuse, creates people who can commit terrible acts while experiencing themselves as heroic. The fragmentation means different parts of the self can hold contradictory beliefs without creating internal conflict. The delusions provide framework that reinterprets cruelty as care, and the childhood trauma that created the disorder in the first place ensures that the only models for relationships are abusive ones, perpetuating cycles of harm across generations. Phyllis Futterman was both victim and perpetrator, someone whose suffering created the exact pathology that made her useful for inflicting suffering on others. But while Coyle and Gooseberry represent pathologies that emerged from identifiable trauma and developed over time, the next prime asset we need to examine demonstrates something psychologically different. What happens when someone is born with an almost complete absence of emotional capacity, when the internal landscape that generates empathy and moral reasoning simply never develops, and when that void learns to wear human behavior like a costume? Let's talk about Franco Barbi and the perfect emptiness. Chapter 4, Franco Barbi and the diagnostic void. Franco Barbi moves through the industrial corridors of the docks with nothing behind his eyes. His face looks cherubic, earning him the nickname Il Bambino, but there's no innocence there, just practiced efficiency and the kind of emptiness that makes murder feel like filing paperwork. Understanding Franco requires confronting an uncomfortable reality about certain psychiatric presentations. Some people are born with neurological differences that make empathy, guilt, and moral reasoning profoundly impaired or absent. And when those people grow up in environments that teach violence as problem solving, the result is someone who can kill without hesitation, remorse, or even particular interest in the act beyond its practical utility. Franco was born in Louisiana to New Orleans Mafia Don Salvatore Barbi, also known as Sally Figs. His mother died during or shortly after his birth, killed by his father, according to Franco's own accounts. This absence created a void that his father never addressed, except through remarriage to a succession of women who came and went from Franco's childhood. 4 stepmothers in total, none providing maternal presence, none staying long enough to form real attachments. The diagnostic consideration here starts with genetic predisposition combined with environmental factors. Children who will develop antisocial personality disorder or psychopathic traits often show early signs, callous, unemotional traits in childhood that predict adult presentations. These include lack of empathy, absence of guilt or remorse, shallow affect where emotional expressions seem performed rather than genuine, and failure to show concern about poor performance in important activities. Franco exhibited these traits from early childhood. School records describe him as unremarkable, completing assignments without engagement, present in body but absent in any meaningful participation. Teachers noted adequate intelligence but zero curiosity. When he got into physical altercations, witnesses described his fighting style as disturbingly efficient. No anger or escalation, just quick targeted violence that ended confrontations immediately. This absence of emotional investment in violence, even during childhood, when most aggression is driven by anger or fear, suggested neurological differences in how Franco processed threat and conflict. The incident when Franco was a preteen was particularly revealing. He used his father's shotgun to kill someone. The recoil broke his cheekbone and worsened facial deformities from Pfeiffer syndrome, a genetic condition affecting skull and facial bone development that he'd been born with. His father's response was approval, possibly the first time Salvatore had shown Franco any pride. This single moment of paternal recognition, earned through murder, set trajectory for Franco's entire life. The psychological pattern here is crucial. Most children, even those with callous, unemotional traits, would experience some internal response to killing another person at age 10. Fear, excitement, confusion, something. Franco's documented response was noticing that violence earned the approval that nothing else could. He learned that murder was problem-solving, that killing carried no moral weight beyond pragmatic effectiveness, and that his father's rare affection could be accessed through acts that would horrify most people. This creates the developmental pathway toward what's clinically termed primary psychopathy or antisocial personality disorder with psychopathic features. The distinction matters. Not everyone with antisocial personality disorder is a psychopath, and the reverse is also true. Psychopathy specifically involves profound deficits in emotional processing, particularly emotions related to fear, empathy, and moral reasoning. Brain imaging studies of people with psychopathic traits show reduced activity in regions associated with processing others' distress, making emotional connections, and experiencing anticipatory anxiety about negative consequences. Franco's progression into adolescence and young adulthood was shaped by constant exposure to violence and obedience. He was absorbed into his father's criminal operations and became an enforcer not through ambition, but expectation. Killing was treated as labor, not as an act requiring justification or reflection. Franco carried out violence with emotional flatness, following instructions rather than developing personal methods or preferences. His effectiveness came from compliance and familiarity with brutality, not from strategy or study. This early conditioning, where approval followed obedience and violence was routine, laid the foundation for the detached, utilitarian killer Murkoff would later refine into a prime asset. This wasn't sadism. Franco never prolonged deaths for psychological gratification. It was professional thoroughness, understanding his tools and their applications well enough to achieve any outcome the situation required. Sadism requires deriving pleasure from causing suffering. Franco derived nothing from the act beyond the practical satisfaction of completing assigned work. The victim's pain was irrelevant to him, neither exciting nor disturbing, just a byproduct of efficient technique. But Franco's violence did escalate in specific contexts that suggest additional pathology developing alongside his primary presentation. He murdered prostitutes with extreme brutality, victims described as looking chewed up by the savagery inflicted on them. His impotence likely contributed to these murders, with Franco compensating for sexual dysfunction through escalating violence. This pattern suggests sexual sadism disorder emerging, where sexual arousal becomes dependent on inflicting suffering because conventional sexual function is impaired. The diagnostic picture becomes more complex here. Franco had primary psychopathy, the emotional void and absence of empathy, but he also developed paraphilic interests, specifically sexual sadism, as compensation for sexual dysfunction. The combination created someone who killed with emotional detachment for work, while also killing with increasing brutality in contexts where the violence served as substitute for sexual expression. When Murkoff identified Franco, he'd just been involved in an incident at Honey Island Motel that demonstrated how dangerous his particular combination of traits had become. He'd killed a woman named Jenny when Murkoff operative Clyde Perry arrived to eliminate him. Perry entered the scene unprepared for what he found, and Franco used that moment of shock to gain the advantage. He overpowered Perry, disarmed him, and shot him in the leg with his Lupara before killing another witness. Perry survived the encounter not because Franco spared him, but because the situation escalated beyond a clean execution. Murkoff's decision to recruit Franco rather than dispose of him reveals how the institution evaluates violence. Franco demonstrated an ability to kill without hesitation, panic, or emotional disruption. He did not require ideological justification, personal gratification, or elaborate conditioning to carry out brutality. Where other prime assets express violence through obsession, ritual, or belief, Franco's value lay in his emptiness. his willingness to follow instructions and perform violence as labor. This made him not safer or more humane, but easier to contain, direct, and ultimately exploit. At Sinyala, Franco was deployed at the docks, a mobster hideout environment designed around his criminal background. The setting included train depots, shipping yards, and warehouses where Franco could indulge his violent impulses while reagents attempted to complete objectives. The industrial brutality of the environment matched his professional approach to violence. The psychological function Franco served was different from Coyle's sadistic authority or Gooseberry's maternal horror. Franco represented pure predatory violence without ideological justification. His complete emotional absence made encounters with him feel like being hunted by something that experienced killing as ordinary work rather than expression of rage or pleasure. The industrial setting emphasized this mechanical quality. Franco did not justify his actions through ideology, ritual, or delusion, nor did he question the structure surrounding him. He operated within Murkoff's fabricated environment without curiosity or resistance, carrying out brutality with the same emotional flatness that defined his life before the trials. This absence of inner conflict made him especially disturbing. Where other prime assets impose meaning onto violence, Franco requires none. He does not need to believe he is right, watched, or free, only that he has been instructed to act. The diagnostic consideration for Franco at Sinyala was antisocial personality disorder with psychopathic features, sexual sadism disorder, secondary to sexual dysfunction, and possible schizoid personality traits given his profound social detachment and limited emotional range. He understood perfectly well that what he was doing was torture. He simply experienced no internal conflict about that fact. What made Franco particularly disturbing was not self-awareness, but its absence. Unlike Mother Gooseberry, who sincerely believed her cruelty was care, Franco did not construct moral narratives around his violence at all. He did not need to believe he was helping, correcting, or serving a higher purpose. He followed instructions and inflicted suffering without reflection, justification, or resistance. The harm he caused did not trouble him, not because he weighed it and dismissed it, but because he never engaged with it as a moral question. Where Gooseberry's violence is wrapped in belief, Franco's is empty, performed without illusion, without conflict, and without the need to understand why. This creates the philosophical question about evil that Franco embodies. Is someone evil if they commit terrible acts without experiencing them as terrible? If the neurological capacity for moral reasoning that would make them recognize wrongness simply doesn't exist, Franco couldn't choose to feel empathy any more than someone without vision could choose to see colors. His brain didn't process others' suffering in ways that generated inhibition or distress. Does that make him less culpable or more dangerous? Easterman documented Franco's psychological stability with clinical approval. His violence was calibrated and controlled, applied with surgical precision rather than chaotic excess. When you looked in his eyes, there was nothing looking back. The psychiatric portrait of Franco Barbi is someone born with profound deficits in emotional processing, particularly empathy and moral reasoning, who grew up in an environment that taught violence as acceptable problem solving. His primary psychopathy made him incapable of experiencing guilt or forming genuine emotional attachments. His sexual sadism disorder, developing as compensation for impotence, added an element of brutality to contexts where violence served as a substitute for sexual expression. And his complete self-awareness about what he was doing, combined with total absence of internal conflict about it, made him perhaps the most purely dangerous prime asset Murkoff employed. Franco demonstrates how certain neurological presentations, when combined with environmental factors that normalize violence, create people who can commit systematic atrocities while experiencing themselves as simply doing assigned work. He never needed ideology to justify his actions. He never needed to believe he was helping anyone. He just needed clear instructions and institutional protection. The emptiness, where empathy and conscience should have developed, meant there was nothing to overcome, no internal resistance to defeat, no moral reasoning to suppress. Murkoff didn't break Franco Barbi. He arrived pre-broken, or perhaps was never whole to begin with. They just gave him infrastructure. Chapter 5. Liliya Bogomolova and the Prophet's Certainty. A child spends her early life confined in a homemade prison cell. She is discovered at age 11, starving and unable to speak, having endured extreme isolation and deprivation. When authorities finally find her, they call her the feral girl. She communicates through animal-like grunts, having never learned language and showing no signs of normal social development. Authorities find her captive, with her mother presumed dead. Years later, investigators tracing her movements through post-war Europe encounter unexplained disappearances of wealthy individuals and the sudden abandonment of vast fortunes. When bodies surface, they are mutilated and staged with overt religious symbolism. The few survivors describe a woman who spoke in religious language about purification and sin. They describe her with reverence usually reserved for saints. Her name is Liliya Bogomolova, and by the time Murkoff identifies her as potential prime asset, she survived the siege of Leningrad under conditions that should have been fatal, later becoming the subject of wartime stories that framed her survival and violence in religious terms, and was eventually confined at Mount Massive Asylum, where Murkoff relied on heavy sedation to limit her ability to influence others. The diagnostic question Liliya presents is the oldest and most uncomfortable in psychiatry. How do you distinguish genuine religious experience from psychotic delusion? When someone claims God speaks to them directly, provides specific instructions, grants them divine authority and mission, how do you determine whether they've encountered something real or whether their brain is generating hallucinations and organizing those hallucinations into a religious framework? Liliya's early life created perfect conditions for severe psychiatric pathology. The isolation she experienced from birth to approximately age 10 would have prevented normal development in every domain. Language acquisition requires exposure during critical windows. Children who don't hear language before certain ages struggle to develop linguistic ability even with intensive intervention. Facial recognition and emotional understanding require interaction during early childhood. The capacity to form attachments depends on receiving care that creates a sense of safety and connection. Liliya received none of this. When discovered at age 11, she showed no evidence of having developed normal language or social recognition. When she arrived at the Sisters of St. Gaspar's orphanage in Paris, she functioned more like a wild animal than an abused child. She moved strangely, her coordination impaired by never having space to explore movement. She exhibited profoundly regressed and disorganized behaviors that reflected the severity of her early deprivation. The other girls avoided her entirely, recognizing something fundamentally wrong even if they couldn't articulate what. The psychiatric expectation would be that this degree of early deprivation would create profound and permanent impairments. Reactive attachment disorder at minimum, given the absence of appropriate caregiving. Severe language deficits that might never fully resolve. Social skills so impaired that integration into normal society would be impossible. Possibly cognitive impairments if the sensory deprivation and malnutrition had affected brain development. But something shifted during Liliya's teenage years at the orphanage. She became obsessed with the Bible. She learned to speak, the process happening rapidly once it began, and she claimed that God himself was talking to her, that divine voice was teaching her how to communicate, how to understand the world, how to function. The sisters and other girls couldn't verify whether Liliya truly heard God's voice. What they observed was transformation in her behavior and abilities. Language development that should have taken years happened in months. Social skills that had been entirely absent began emerging. And something else appeared, charisma that made other girls who'd previously shunned her begin warming to her presence. This is where the diagnostic picture becomes genuinely ambiguous. From a psychiatric perspective, what's called a compensatory delusion, a systematized, false belief that provided a framework for making sense of her traumatic history and current experiences. Hearing God's voice gave meaning to suffering that would otherwise be unbearable. The claim that she was the Russian Joan of Arc, chosen for a divine mission to liberate St. Petersburg from German forces, provided identity and purpose where there had been only confusion and isolation. From a psychiatric perspective, her presentation could be interpreted as a delusional system with grandiose and religious features. Her core delusion centered on having been chosen by God for a specific sacred mission. This belief was systematized. She had explanations for everything, interpreted events through her delusional lens, and couldn't be dissuaded by contrary evidence because the delusion had become her entire reality structure. She wasn't hallucinating in the visual sense. She could accurately perceive the physical environment. She wasn't disorganized. Her speech was coherent, and her plans were methodical. The delusion itself was non-bizarre in that it concerned something that could theoretically exist: divine calling and mission, even though her specific interpretation was likely false. But here is where the account becomes more ambiguous. Stories circulated during and after the siege of Leningrad describing her survival and violence in almost mythic terms. The Angel of Leningrad stories circulated among both Russian and German forces. Her actions were widely rumored and attributed symbolic importance. Accounts later emerged claiming she survived severe torture at the hands of enemy forces, including injuries that should have left her permanently disabled, such as removal of her tongue, or at least Liliya could speak again after torture that should have left her permanently mute. The medical explanation would involve incomplete removal, suggesting the soldiers cut her tongue but didn't fully excise it, allowing for scar tissue to form a functional stump. The miracle explanation is that God restored her ability to speak because her mission required it, a belief reinforced when she reportedly convinced her guards to release her using that very tongue. Neither explanation can be definitively proven or disproven based on available evidence. This ambiguity is precisely what made Liliya so disturbing as a psychological case. She exhibited profound conviction that she spoke with divine authority and could draw others into her worldview through certainty and charisma, where her delusions were transmitted to others through force of personality and certainty. Wealthy industrialists who encountered her began giving away fortunes and mutilating themselves in pursuit of spiritual purification she prescribed. Murkoff personnel judged her influence over others to be severe enough to require strict containment. Reagents who entered her program at Sinyala often emerged either psychologically destroyed or converted to her worldview in ways that made them believe suffering served sacred purposes. The mechanism behind this influence combines several psychological factors. First, Liliya's absolute certainty creates psychological pressure on others to accept her framework. When someone speaks with complete conviction about divine truth, listeners experience cognitive dissonance between their skepticism and the speaker's unwavering belief. Resolving that dissonance often involves adopting elements of the conviction rather than maintaining doubt. Second, Liliya's traumatic history and survival of circumstances that should have been fatal create a sense that she might genuinely be protected by something beyond normal human resilience. The homemade prison should have destroyed her cognitive development. The siege should have killed her. The torture should have left her mute. Her survival of each impossible circumstance feels like evidence supporting her claims about divine protection and mission. Third, Liliya's charisma, which emerged after she learned language, makes people want to believe her. The magnetism isn't manipulative charm. It's the compelling quality of someone who has suffered extremely and found meaning in that suffering, who offers a framework where pain serves purposes rather than being meaningless trauma. For people who've experienced their own suffering without finding meaning, Liliya's certainty that God speaks through broken prophets can be psychologically irresistible. At Sinyala, Liliya was incorporated into the resort environment as part of Project LATHE. Reagents who entered her station encountered someone who presented as a religious figure offering spiritual guidance and purification. She prescribed self-mortification, instructed reagents to cut away their sins, spoke about God's requirements for salvation. The reagents' desperate psychological state, already damaged by previous programs, made them vulnerable to her influence in ways they wouldn't have been under normal circumstances. The diagnostic consideration for Liliya includes delusional disorder with grandiose and religious features, possible post-traumatic stress disorder from her childhood imprisonment and wartime experiences, and profound charisma that allowed transmission of her delusional framework to others. She showed no insight into her condition, which is characteristic of delusional disorders. From her perspective, she wasn't ill. Everything she believed, she'd witnessed. God had spoken to her, protected her, given her mission. The fact that her tongue had regenerated after torture proved divine intervention. The fact that people recognized the truth in her words proved she was a prophet rather than psychiatric patient. The additional psychiatric concept relevant to understanding Liliya is the idea of cultural and historical context shaping diagnosis. In medieval Europe, someone with Liliya's presentation might have been recognized as mystic or saint. Her visions would have been interpreted as genuine religious experiences. Her survival of impossible circumstances would have been considered miracles. Her ability to inspire devotion would have been seen as evidence of grace rather than pathology. In contemporary psychiatric framework, the same presentation gets diagnosed as delusional disorder. The visions are hallucinations. The survival is coincidence or explainable through natural means. The charisma is manipulation or shared psychotic disorder. Neither framework can be proven absolutely correct because both rest on unprovable assumptions about whether divine communication actually occurs or whether all such experiences are neurological phenomena. This created a unique problem for Murkoff. Other prime assets had clear pathologies that could be understood and managed through psychiatric and pharmaceutical means. Coyle's sadism, Gooseberry's dissociation, Franco's emotional detachment all fell within conventional diagnostic categories with established treatment approaches. If her experiences were framed as religious rather than pathological, suppressing them raised questions Murkoff chose not to resolve. If her influence came from legitimate spiritual authority, then preventing her from speaking to others was suppression of religion rather than protection of vulnerable people. Murkoff's solution at Mount Massive had been to keep her heavily sedated chemical catatonia that prevented her from influencing staff. But this approach had limitations. She couldn't function as prime asset if she was unconscious. When they transferred her to Sinyala for Project LATHE, they needed to find a balance where she could interact with reagents while maintaining enough control that she didn't convert facility staff into self-mutilating devotees. Murkoff relied on pharmaceutical suppression to limit her influence while maintaining basic functionality. Conscious and functional, but with emotional flattening that reduced the intensity of her charismatic presence. This made her effective with reagents who were already psychologically vulnerable, while preventing her from having the overwhelming influence she demonstrated with Mount Massive employees. The dosing had to be precisely calibrated. Too much, and she became non-functional. Too little, and her influence began spreading beyond intended parameters. Easterman's interest in Liliya extended beyond her immediate utility as a prime asset. She represented a test case for questions about the relationship between trauma, religious experience, and psychological resilience. Her childhood should have destroyed her capacity for normal development. Instead, she'd emerged with abilities that seemed enhanced rather than impaired. Her language acquisition, once it began, had been remarkably rapid. Her social intelligence, the ability to read others and understand what would move them toward her worldview, was sophisticated despite her having spent formative years without any social contact. The psychiatric explanation would involve exceptional neurological plasticity, unusual ability of her brain to reorganize and develop capacities during adolescence that normally require childhood foundation, combined with high intelligence and the compensatory development that sometimes occurs when other areas are impaired. This could explain her rapid language learning and social skill development without requiring supernatural intervention. The religious explanation is that God took someone broken beyond normal human repair and remade her into an instrument of divine will, that her abilities came from grace rather than neurology, that her mission and the authority backing it were real. Liliya's story forces the question that makes psychiatry most uncomfortable. If someone's delusion makes them more functional rather than less, if their religious conviction provides meaning that allows them to survive circumstances that would destroy others, if their claimed divine experiences result in behaviors and abilities that seem to exceed normal human capacity, at what point does treating them as mentally ill become imposing one metaphysical framework over another, rather than addressing objective pathology? The answer psychiatry provides is pragmatic rather than philosophical. Regardless of whether Liliya's experiences were genuine or delusional, the outcome of her influence was harm. People who believed her teachings about purification through mutilation ended up dead or permanently damaged. Her conviction that God required suffering led to suffering that served no therapeutic purpose and provided no actual spiritual benefit that could be objectively verified. Therefore, treatment was justified by outcomes, rather than by determining whether her claimed experiences were real. But Murkoff wasn't interested in treatment. They wanted to weaponize exactly the influence that made Liliya dangerous. They gave her access to reagents who were already psychologically broken, people whose existing vulnerabilities made them susceptible to religious frameworks that promised meaning for their suffering. And Liliya, with absolute conviction that she was serving divine purposes, prescribed the very suffering she'd experienced as a path to purification and salvation. The psychiatric portrait of Liliya Bogomolova is someone whose extreme childhood deprivation should have created profound impairments, but instead, through mechanisms that remain psychiatrically ambiguous, emerged with exceptional abilities and unshakable conviction in divine mission. Whether that conviction represents delusional disorder or genuine religious experience cannot be definitively determined. What can be determined is that her influence on others was powerful and often destructive, that she could transmit her beliefs through charisma and certainty, and that institutions repeatedly failed to manage her through conventional psychiatric means. She represents the limit case for psychiatric diagnosis, the point where distinguishing pathology from spiritual experience becomes philosophically rather than clinically resolvable. And Murkoff's decision to employ her rather than treat her demonstrates how institutions can exploit ambiguity. Taking someone whose status as prophet or patient remains uncertain and using that uncertainty as a weapon against people too broken to maintain skepticism. But we've covered 5 figures now. There's one more pairing we need to examine before the diagnostic picture is complete, and this one demonstrates what happens when aristocratic entitlement fuses with chemical contamination, when genetic connection becomes pathological enmeshment, when two people become one organism. Let's talk about the Kress twins and the horror of merged identity. Chapter 6: Otto and Aurora Kress and the Pathology of Fusion. Deep in the Sinyala facility, two figures move as one organism. Otto and Aurora Kress, conjoined twins born into a wealthy American industrial family. Their bodies fused in ways that make it impossible to determine where one ends and the other begins. They hunt through shadows with the patience of predators who've never known anything except getting exactly what they want. Their movements synchronized in ways that suggest either profound connection or complete loss of individual identity. Understanding the Kress twins requires examining multiple layers of pathology simultaneously. There's the physical reality of their conjoined condition, which creates unique psychological challenges and developmental complications. There's their background of inherited wealth, which fostered entitlement and the belief that money could bend reality around them. There's the toxic chemical exposure tied to the Kress fortune, implicated in their condition and potentially contributing to later instability. And there's the question of whether two conjoined people can develop individual personalities at all, or whether their fusion makes them something psychologically unprecedented. The psychiatric literature on conjoined twins is limited because the condition is rare, occurring in approximately 1 in every 50,000 to 200,000 births. Most conjoined twins are stillborn or die shortly after birth. Those who survive face extraordinary medical and psychological challenges. The degree of fusion determines what's possible surgically and what kinds of independent function each twin can achieve. Some conjoined twins share only minimal tissue and can potentially be separated. Others share vital organs in ways that make separation impossible without killing one or both. Otto and Aurora fall into the latter category. Their fusion is extensive enough that separation was not treated as a viable option. They've spent their entire lives in bodies that are simultaneously two people and one organism, sharing some biological systems while maintaining separate consciousnesses, at least theoretically. The psychological development of conjoined twins raises questions that psychiatry has no clear frameworks for addressing. Normal child development assumes physical autonomy, the ability to move independently, to have experiences separate from caregivers and siblings, to develop a sense of self as distinct individual. Conjoined twins can never have that autonomy. Every movement requires coordination. Every experience is shared. Privacy is impossible. The boundaries that normally define where one person ends and another begins are literally absent. This creates potential for several pathological developments. First, difficulty establishing individual identity. If you've never experienced being separate from another person, how do you develop a sense of yourself as distinct individual with your own desires, beliefs, and agency? Second, enmeshment that goes beyond normal codependency into something more extreme. When you literally cannot exist apart from another person, the psychological fusion can match the physical fusion, creating a merged identity where individual preferences and needs become indistinguishable from shared ones. Third, profound anger and resentment about the lack of autonomy, directed both at each other and at the world that created this situation. The Kress family background added additional complications to what was already a psychologically fraught situation. They were wealthy American industrialists from Buffalo, New York, accustomed to privilege and the belief that money could solve any problem. Their father, Anton Kress, was proprietor of Kress Chemical. When Otto and Aurora were born conjoined, the family's response was to hide them from public view while seeking medical solutions that didn't exist. The twins grew up in isolation, surrounded by luxury but excluded from normal social interaction, receiving care from servants but little genuine emotional connection from family members who seemed embarrassed by their condition. This created the worst possible psychological environment for children, already facing extraordinary challenges. They learned that their existence was a shameful secret to be concealed. They experienced their physical condition as a source of family embarrassment rather than as a neutral fact requiring adaptation. And they had access to wealth that taught them the world should accommodate their desires while simultaneously experiencing profound powerlessness over their own bodies and circumstances. The toxic exposure Murkoff references adds another layer. Otto and Aurora were conjoined at birth due to in utero exposure to toxic chemicals tied to the Kress industrial world. Whatever else that exposure did to them, it left behind the impression of volatility, aggression, disinhibition, and instability that may not be purely psychological. The diagnostic picture for the Kress twins has to address them both individually and as merged entity. As individuals, each likely experienced identity disturbance, the profound difficulty establishing a stable sense of self when you've never existed as a separate person. They probably both had attachment difficulties, given their isolation and the family's emotional withdrawal. The chemical exposure may have created organic personality changes, alterations in brain function that affected behavior independently of psychological factors, but the more significant pathology is what emerged from their fusion. They developed something closer to a fused identity, an extreme enmeshment shaped by a lifetime of enforced coordination. Though no formal diagnosis cleanly captures what conjoined development can produce, their sense of self blurred together to the point where distinguishing Otto's desires from Aurora's became impossible. They spoke in synchronized fashion, finished each other's sentences or spoke simultaneously, and moved with coordination that suggested profound attunement and practiced unity. The aristocratic entitlement combined with their conjoined condition in particularly toxic ways. They believed the world owed them accommodation, while simultaneously resenting that any accommodation was necessary. They demanded that others treat them as normal, while also expecting special privileges because of their condition. This created constant interpersonal conflict, where nothing anyone did could satisfy them because their fundamental situation, being conjoined, couldn't be resolved through others' behavior. When violence emerged in their behavioral patterns, it took forms that reflected their merged identity. They hunted together with such precise coordination that victims described being attacked by a single entity rather than two people. They showed no disagreement about targeting or methods, suggesting either complete alignment of values and preferences or suppression of individual differences, so complete that dissent became psychologically impossible. The intimate dimensions of their development created complications that most medical and psychiatric frameworks aren't built to address. As conjoined twins sharing significant anatomy, privacy was impossible, autonomy was compromised, and their sense of bodily ownership was distorted from the beginning. Add entitlement and confinement, and the result is a volatile mix of frustration, resentment, and boundary collapse. This combination could distort attachment, desire, and aggression in ways that are difficult to untangle cleanly. Their violence often reads less like impulse and more like compensation, control inflicted outward to replace autonomy they never had inward. Murkoff's acquisition of the Kress twins followed a different logic than the street-level capture of other prime assets. Otto and Aurora came from wealth and corporate insulation, the kind of privilege that buys silence and containment until it doesn't. When their violence became too big to keep inside the family world, Murkoff had a ready-made answer. Take them, repurpose them, and make the horror useful. The family could remove the twins from their environment, eliminating the embarrassment and threat they represented. The twins could be given an outlet for their violent impulses in a controlled setting that wouldn't result in prosecution, and Murkoff gained prime assets, whose unique psychology and physical condition created opportunities for experimental protocols that couldn't be attempted with single individuals. At Sinyala, the Kress twins were deployed as prime assets in the shopping mall environment, where their merged nature and entitlement became part of the terror. Reagents who encountered them faced something psychologically destabilizing beyond simple physical threat. The twins moved as one, spoke as one, seemed to know what each other would do with the perfect synchronization that comes from a lifetime of forced coordination and fused habit. This violated fundamental assumptions about human individuality in ways that created existential dread, independent of whatever actual violence followed. The twins also demonstrated the aristocratic belief that reagents were beneath consideration as fellow humans, objects to be used and discarded without moral weight. This dehumanization served Project LATHE's purposes by reinforcing reagents' sense of powerlessness and worthlessness. When the twins treated them as less than human, it validated the internal messages that trauma was already creating, the belief that they deserved what was happening, that they mattered less than other people, that their suffering was insignificant. The diagnostic formulation for Otto and Aurora Kress includes extreme enmeshment shaped by conjoined development, entitlement shaped by wealth and isolation, and volatility plausibly worsened by toxic exposure. Their behavior suggests disinhibition and aggression that may not be purely psychological, and their violence demonstrated planning and coordination that indicated intact cognitive function despite other distortions. The additional psychiatric consideration is whether conjoined twins can be held individually accountable for shared actions. If Otto and Aurora functioned as a merged entity, moving and deciding as one organism, can you meaningfully distinguish one twin's responsibility from the others? Legal and ethical frameworks assume individual agency and separate decision-making. Conjoined twins who've developed shared identity challenge those assumptions in ways that create unresolvable ambiguity about moral and criminal responsibility. Murkoff exploited this ambiguity the same way they exploited every other aspect of prime asset pathology. The twins' unique condition made them psychologically devastating to reagents, while creating plausible deniability about accountability. If reagents complained about the twins' behavior, which twin was responsible? If violence occurred, which one had initiated it and which had merely failed to prevent it? The inability to assign individual responsibility created an environment where the twins could act with impunity. The Kress twins represent what happens when physical condition creates psychological impossibilities, when aristocratic entitlement meets profound powerlessness, when chemical contamination damages neurological function, and when institutions decide that merged identity can serve institutional purposes. They weren't broken by Sinyala. They arrived already broken in ways that normal human development couldn't have produced, their fusion creating pathology that no single individual could exhibit. Their story demonstrates how Murkoff selected for diversity of pathology. Each prime asset represents a different answer to how minds break and how those breaks can be weaponized. Coyle brought sadism and institutional authority. Gooseberry brought dissociation and maternal horror. Franco brought psychopathic emptiness. Liliya brought religious conviction that might be prophecy or delusion, and the Kress twins brought fusion that violated assumptions about individuality and agency. Together, these prime assets created an environment where every possible psychological vulnerability could be identified and exploited, where reagents encountered systematic attacks on every defense mechanism human beings developed to protect themselves from trauma. That comprehensive assault on consciousness was the point. Project LATHE wasn't designed to break people in one specific way. It was designed to break people in every possible way simultaneously, destroying every psychological structure that creates a coherent sense of self. We've examined the individual pathologies, the specific mental disorders, and personality structures that made each prime asset effective at their assigned roles. But focusing only on individual diagnoses misses the larger psychiatric picture. Sinyala itself had a pathology, an institutional dysfunction that was more than the sum of individual disorders. Understanding that systemic pathology requires stepping back from diagnostic categories and examining how organizations can develop collective madness that enables and encourages individual atrocities. The psychiatric concept of institutional betrayal describes what happens when organizations that are supposed to protect people instead harm them. Hospitals that abuse patients, schools that enable predators, corporations that poison communities. These betrayals create unique trauma because they violate fundamental assumptions about how society functions. We're taught that institutions exist to serve collective good, that authority figures are trustworthy, that official purposes match actual practices. When institutions systematically violate these assumptions while maintaining appearance of legitimacy, the psychological damage extends beyond individual harm to epistemological crises about what can be trusted or believed. Sinyala represented institutional betrayal at industrial scale. Reagents were told they were volunteers in a sanctioned research program. The paperwork they signed, or believed they signed, during chemically induced states where consent was compromised, framed participation as duty and necessity. The facility itself looked like a legitimate research installation, with medical equipment and professional protocols and staff wearing lab coats, speaking clinical language. Every element was designed to maintain an illusion of legitimacy, while conducting experiments that violated every ethical principle medicine and psychology had established. This created a situation where regents couldn't trust their own perceptions. If this looked like hospital and staff acted like doctors, but the treatment was torture, which reality was true? The cognitive dissonance destroyed reagents' ability to evaluate their circumstances accurately, making them vulnerable to exactly the psychological manipulation Project LATHE was designed to induce. The organizational structure that enabled Sinyala demonstrates how institutional pathology develops through diffusion of responsibility and moral disengagement. Few people, and perhaps only leadership figures like Easterman, understood the full scope of what was happening. Scientists focused on narrow research questions without examining larger context. Medical staff provided care that kept reagents alive without questioning why subjects needed so much medical intervention after therapeutic programs. Security personnel maintained containment without investigating what they were containing. Administrators processed paperwork without considering what the documents actually authorized. This compartmentalization is psychologically protective for individuals participating in institutional atrocities. Each person can tell themselves they're just doing their specific job, following procedures, serving a role that someone would fill regardless of their individual participation. The moral weight gets distributed across so many people that no one person has to carry full burden of acknowledging they're contributing to torture program. Psychologist Stanley Milgram demonstrated this dynamic in his famous obedience experiments, where ordinary people administered what they believed were dangerous electric shocks to other participants when instructed by authority figures wearing lab coats. The majority of participants continued shockingly even when the victim screamed and pleaded, because the authority figure said the experiment required it. Milgram's experiment suggested that ordinary people can commit acts they believe are harmful when authority, procedure, and institutional context provide permission and diffuse responsibility. Sinyala functioned through the same mechanisms. Staff who might have refused to torture someone in different contexts found themselves participating in systematic abuse because institutional structure said it was research, because authority figures framed it as necessary, because their role was limited enough that they could avoid confronting full horror of what they were enabling. A useful way to describe this organizational dynamic is institutional compartmentalization, where the institution itself fragments knowledge and responsibility in ways that parallel how individual minds dissociate to avoid traumatic awareness. Just as Phyllis Futterman's consciousness split into separate alters that couldn't access each other's memories, Murkoff's organizational structure split knowledge and moral accountability into separate compartments that couldn't or wouldn't communicate. The additional factor that enabled Sinyala was what psychologists call moral disengagement, the psychological processes that allow people to commit harmful acts without experiencing normal guilt or moral distress. This includes euphemistic labeling, calling torture stress testing, or enhanced interrogation. It includes advantageous comparison, arguing that this research prevents worse outcomes like communist infiltration. It includes displacement of responsibility, claiming you're just following orders. And it includes dehumanization of victims, viewing reagents as experimental subjects rather than people with rights and dignity. Murkoff's records and Easterman's framing suggest these mechanisms operating throughout Sinyala's hierarchy. Scientists wrote about reagent stress responses and compliance metrics without using language that acknowledged they were describing human suffering. Medical staff recorded physical damage as data points without expressing concern about causation. Security personnel discussed containment of subjects who'd become aggressive without questioning why the therapeutic program was creating aggression requiring containment. The systemic diagnosis for Sinyala includes institutional betrayal as primary pathology, diffusion of responsibility, and moral disengagement as enabling mechanisms, and compartmentalization, creating systemic dissociation where no single person had to confront full scope of institutional harm. The organization functioned as a collective psychopath, lacking empathy and conscience while maintaining a superficial appearance of legitimacy and purpose. This institutional pathology selected for and empowered individuals whose personal pathologies aligned with organizational needs. Coyle's sadism, Gooseberry's delusions, Franco's emptiness, Liliya's religious certainty, the Kress twins' merged entitlement, all found institutional home at Sinyala precisely because their individual disorders served collective dysfunction. The institution didn't create these people, but it recognized their utility and gave them authority and resources to enact their pathologies at scale. The outcome was systematic destruction of human consciousness, conducted with bureaucratic efficiency and scientific documentation. Reagents were processed through programs designed to break psychological structure and produce compliance. Some died during trials, some emerged so damaged they couldn't function in society, some were successfully conditioned into sleeper agents, trained to respond to triggers they didn't consciously understand, and some retained enough of themselves to eventually resist, to recognize what was happening, to plan escape or rebellion. But even those who physically escaped carried Sinyala inside them. The trauma became part of their identity, reshaping how they understood themselves and the world. The institutional betrayal destroyed their ability to trust authority or believe official explanations. The torture created flashbacks and hypervigilance that made normal life impossible, and the complicity they'd been forced into, the times they'd betrayed other reagents or participated in violence against fellow victims because resistance meant worse suffering, created moral injury that questioned their fundamental worth as human beings. This lasting impact demonstrates the final aspect of Sinyala's pathology. The institution didn't just harm people temporarily, it installed permanent psychological damage that served Murkoff's interests long after reagents left the facility. Even reagents who weren't successfully conditioned as sleeper agents carried trauma that made them vulnerable to future manipulation, easier to control through threatened return to Sinyala-like conditions, less likely to report what had happened because who would believe them and what authority could they trust to investigate? The systemic diagnosis reveals that focusing only on prime asset pathology misses the larger picture. The individual disorders mattered because they made specific people effective at specific roles. But the institutional disorder mattered more because it created an environment where every form of individual pathology could be channeled toward the collective goal of industrialized psychological destruction. Sinyala was a machine built from broken people, designed to break more people, operating with the efficiency and documentation of legitimate research while conducting atrocities that violated every ethical principle its facade claimed to uphold. The individuals who designed it, directed it, staffed it, and served as its instruments of trauma were all necessary components. But the machine was greater and more terrible than any individual pathology because it systematized cruelty and made horror into protocol. Chapter 8: The Diagnosis That Matters Most. We've covered the clinical diagnoses, the specific mental disorders that characterized each prime asset and made them useful to Murkoff's purposes. But there's one more diagnosis we need to address, the one that connects all of these disparate pathologies to larger questions about how society functions and what happens when institutional power meets vulnerable populations. That diagnosis isn't about individual mental illness, it's about systemic evil, about how organizations identify people whose specific forms of psychological damage make them useful, give them authority over those with less power, and create environments where the worst aspects of human psychology can flourish while maintaining the appearance of legitimacy and purpose. The historical precedent is obvious. Nazi doctors conducting experiments in concentration camps, claiming scientific necessity while torturing prisoners. Soviet psychiatrists diagnosing political dissidents with fabricated mental illnesses to justify imprisonment and forced treatment. American researchers infected impoverished black men with syphilis while pretending to provide health care, studying disease progression without offering cure even after penicillin became available. Japanese Unit 7. 31 conducting biological warfare experiments on prisoners. The list extends through every major power and across all of modern history. These weren't isolated incidents of individual psychiatrists or doctors going rogue. They were institutional programs, officially sanctioned and resourced, operating with bureaucratic oversight and documentation. The perpetrators weren't uniquely evil individuals whose pathology was aberrant. They were ordinary people whose specific psychological characteristics made them suited for work that institutions needed done, and the institutions provided context where that work could happen with career advancement rather than criminal prosecution as consequence. Sinyala fits this pattern precisely. Project LATHE built on genuine government programs like MK Ultra that had already established that psychological experimentation on unwitting subjects was possible when national security provided justification. Murkoff simply privatized the research, removing it from government oversight while maintaining the scientific language and institutional structure that made it appear legitimate. They recruited people whose mental disorders made them effective at inflicting trauma. They created organizational structures that diffused responsibility and enabled moral disengagement, and they documented everything with the same clinical detachment that Nazi doctors used when recording how long prisoners survived exposure experiments. The psychiatric question this raises is one the field has never satisfactorily answered. How do you prevent institutions from exploiting mental illness in service of atrocity? The individuals who become institutional instruments of horror, prime assets in Murkoff's language, often have genuine psychiatric conditions that would benefit from treatment. But when institutions decide certain pathologies are assets rather than illnesses, treatment becomes suppression of useful traits. Coyle's sadism needed management in a civilian context, but was a valuable feature at Sinyala. Gooseberry's dissociation would normally be treated to help her develop a more integrated identity, but her fragmentation made her effective at destabilizing reagents. Franco's psychopathy would typically be managed through structured environments, limiting his ability to harm others, but Murkoff gave him victims and institutional protection. The uncomfortable truth is that mental illness exists on a spectrum where some presentations, in certain contexts, provide advantages. Reduced empathy makes it easier to make ruthless decisions without emotional interference. Sadistic features make someone effective at interrogation and intimidation. Delusional conviction can inspire devotion in others. Narcissistic need for achievement drives accomplishment in competitive fields. Psychopathic charm facilitates manipulation and social climbing. Most of the time, these traits create more problems than benefits, damaging relationships and leading to outcomes that harm both the individual and others. But when institutions need specific forms of cruelty delivered systematically, they can identify people whose pathologies align with institutional goals and create contexts where disorder becomes an asset. This is the diagnosis that matters most, not the individual disorders, but the systemic dynamic where institutions exploit pathology. Mental illness becomes weaponized, not because disturbed individuals seek out opportunities to harm others, though some do, but because institutions with resources and authority actively recruit people whose specific disorders make them useful, provide them with victims and protection from consequences, and frame their pathology as service rather than illness. Breaking this cycle would require several interventions that society has consistently failed to implement. First, genuine oversight of institutional research and treatment programs, with independent monitoring that can identify abuse without relying on the institution to self-report. Second, protection for whistleblowers who report institutional misconduct, ensuring that people who witness atrocity can speak without destroying their careers or safety. Third, accountability that extends to organizational leaders rather than stopping at individual perpetrators, recognizing that institutional evil requires institutional consequences, but most fundamentally, it requires recognizing that certain mental disorders, particularly those that impair empathy and moral reasoning, create genuine danger when combined with institutional authority. Someone with antisocial personality disorder and sadistic features shouldn't be given power over vulnerable populations, regardless of how effective they might be at achieving institutional goals. Someone with delusional disorder shouldn't be placed in a position where their delusions can be transmitted to people too psychologically damaged to maintain skepticism. Someone with primary psychopathy shouldn't be deployed as an instrument of systematic trauma. These seem like obvious principles, but institutions repeatedly violate them because the people with these disorders are effective at work that institutions need done, work that people with intact empathy and moral reasoning would refuse to do, or would do less efficiently because guilt and horror would interfere with performance. Sinyala's prime assets were selected specifically because their pathologies made them willing and able to torture systematically without the emotional interference that would compromise someone with normal psychological function. That's not an accident or oversight. That's institutional design, recognizing what mental illness can accomplish when given authority and victims. The final diagnosis, the one that encompasses all the individual pathologies and the institutional dysfunction, is this: we live in a world where organizations with resources and authority can identify people whose mental disorders make them useful for harm, provide those people with victims and protection, and operate for years or decades before facing consequences if they ever face consequences at all. That's not mental illness in individuals. That's pathology in how power functions, in how institutions operate, in how society decides whose suffering matters and whose can be rationalized as necessary, cost of progress or security or profit. Every prime asset at Sinyala had genuine psychiatric conditions that shaped their behavior and made them dangerous, but they became instruments of systematic atrocity because Murkoff Corporation recognized their utility and gave them infrastructure. The mental disorders mattered, but the institution that weaponized those disorders mattered more. And that's the diagnosis we need to sit with. The uncomfortable recognition that mental illness becomes most dangerous not when it emerges in isolated individuals, but when institutions decide it's useful and create contexts where pathology can flourish under protection of official purpose and bureaucratic legitimacy. Conclusion: what remains? The Sinyala facility eventually closed. Project LATHE officially ended when federal oversight of classified research intensified, and Murkoff's corporate leadership decided the program's risks outweighed its benefits. The physical location was abandoned, documentation was secured or destroyed, and prime assets were managed in various ways depending on how valuable they remained and how dangerous they'd become. Some reagents escaped or were released, carrying trauma that would shape the rest of their lives. Some died during trials or shortly after from complications medical staff attributed to pre-existing conditions. Some remain unaccounted for, their fates lost in documentation gaps or deliberately obscured to avoid accountability. But the techniques developed at Sinyala didn't end with the facility. Research findings were preserved. Easterman's protocols were refined and adapted for future applications. The knowledge about how to break human consciousness systematically, how to identify and exploit psychological vulnerabilities, how to create conditioning that persists without conscious awareness, all of that remained institutional, property-serving corporate interests. The mental disorders we've diagnosed tonight, the antisocial personality disorder and sadism, the dissociative identity disorder and maternal delusion, the primary psychopathy and emotional absence, the delusional disorder that might be prophecy, the shared identity of conjoined twins, all of these continue existing in people throughout society. Most will never encounter institutions that weaponize their pathology. Most will struggle with their disorders in ordinary ways, receiving treatment or not, causing harm or not, living lives shaped by conditions they didn't choose and can't fully control. But some will find themselves in contexts where their specific pathology becomes valuable to organizations with goals that require systematic cruelty. Police departments will recruit people whose sadism and authority needs make them effective at intimidation. Corporations will promote people whose psychopathy makes them ruthless in competitive markets. Intelligence agencies will employ people whose capacity for violence without remorse makes them suitable for wet work. Religious organizations will elevate people whose delusional conviction inspires devotion in followers. And the cycle continues, institutions identifying useful pathology, providing context where disorder becomes an asset, extracting value from mental illness while maintaining appearance of legitimacy and purpose. That's the final lesson from diagnosing every mental disorder in Outlast Trials. The individual pathologies matter for understanding how specific people became capable of specific atrocities. But the systemic pathology matters more for understanding why those atrocities happened, why they keep happening, why institutions with resources and authority will always find people whose mental disorders make them useful, and will always create environments where the worst aspects of human psychology can be deployed in service of organizational goals. The prime assets weren't exceptional. They were people whose specific forms of psychological damage aligned with institutional needs. In another context, with different opportunities or different interventions, some might have lived unremarkable lives, causing only ordinary amounts of harm. But Sinyala found them, recognized what they could do, and gave them victims and permission and protection. And somewhere right now, other institutions are doing the same thing, identifying people whose mental disorders make them valuable, providing them with authority over vulnerable populations, creating contexts where pathology flourishes under bureaucratic legitimacy. That's the diagnosis that should keep us awake rather than lulling us to sleep. Mental illness exists on a spectrum throughout the human population. Most of it causes suffering without serving any purpose, but some presentations, in some contexts, become weapons when institutions decide they're useful. And we haven't yet figured out how to prevent that weaponization, how to protect vulnerable people from institutions that view them as resources to be exploited, how to stop the cycle where damaged people damage others under official sanction. Sinyala ended. The prime assets were dispersed or disposed of. The reagents who survived carry scars that will never fully heal, but the knowledge remains, the techniques persist, and institutions continue operating with the same logic that created Project LATHE in the first place. That's the uncomfortable truth at the heart of every diagnosis we've examined tonight. The mental disorders are real, the individual pathologies matter, but the systemic evil that recognizes those pathologies as useful and creates infrastructure for deploying them, that's what transforms individual illness into industrialized horror.